It shall be unlawful for the owner or custodian of any animal to permit the animal to run at large.
Now, I see a problem with that citation. It applies to animals that the person owns. That would include only domesticated animals, right?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's the very definition of animal at large. If you go back to the definition sections, the definition 12, animal at large shall mean an animal not under the restraint and off the premises of its owner.
Then that also means that since feral cats are legally considered to be wild animals and individuals cannot own them, the citation running at large wouldn't apply to feral cats.
Well, that's true, and that's what the statute seems to be saying anyway. But let's go back to our chart. At the bottom, let's add at large prohibited, the statute at 3135. And because it requires, it's a statute restricting what an owner can do with its animal, it applies only to domesticated animals because domesticated animals can be owned and wild animals cannot.
But running at large now is not the only citation that people receive who are feeding feral cats, because they sometimes are cited for either failure to license or failure to vaccinate.
Well, these are two more statutes that we really should read in order to understand properly. Failure to license is a reference to Section 3145, ferret, dog, and cat licenses. A ferret, dog, or cat which is 4 months of age or older shall be licensed by the owner, as herein provided.
Well, there's the word owner again. So the law about licensing seems to only apply to owned animals. But what about the requirement to vaccinate?
Well, let's look at that slide as well, that statute as well. That's Section 3186, vaccination of ferrets, dogs, and cats. No person shall own or harbor a ferret, dog, or cat over the age of 4 months in the county without a valid rabies vaccination.
So we have to vaccinate animals that we own for rabies. But what about harboring? What does that mean? Great question.
Let's look at the definition of harboring, keeping or harboring in the statute, and read it. That's definition 50. Keeping or harboring shall mean the act by an owner or occupant of real property, either of feeding or sheltering any domesticated animal.
Well, the law seems to be very consistent. If keeping or harboring applied to wild animals, we would own all of the birds at our bird feeders. But since the keeping or harboring definition is limited to domestic animals, and since feral cats are defined in the law as wild, keeping or harboring doesn't apply to feral cats.
There's actually another reason why keeping or harboring doesn't apply to feral cats. And in fact, the reason why some of these other statutes as well don't apply to feral cats. You might think that you know what a cat is, but in legal terms, you really have to look at the definition in the statute. And so if we look at the definition for cat, it's number 27. Cat shall mean domesticated felines. The term cat shall not include wild or exotic felines.
So the law requires that cats must be licensed, but the term cat does not include wild animals, and feral cats are defined as wild animals in the statute.
The statute seems to be consistent that feral cats are not subject to the same requirements as domesticated animals.
But yet there are many, many residents of the county who have been told by animal control officers to stop feeding feral cats. So doesn't the law say anything about not feeding?
Well, as a matter of fact, it does. Let's start with the Maryland Code of Regulations. Crimes relating to animals, 10604. Abuse or neglect of an animal. Prohibited activities. These are prohibited. A person may not, number 1, overdrive or overload an animal. Number 2, deprive an animal of necessary sustenance. Or number 3, cause, procure, or authorize an act prohibited under 1, 2, or 3 of the subsection.
But that law says that it is prohibited to not feed or to cause someone to not feed.
As a matter of fact, the Prince George's County statute is even clearer. The definition of cruelty, which is number 35, cruelty shall mean any act of commission or omission whereby unjustifiable physical harm or pain, suffering, or death is caused or permitted, including failure to provide proper drink, air, space, shelter, or protection from the elements, veterinary care, or nutritious food in sufficient quantities with respect to an animal.
It looks like causing a person to not provide food, shelter, or veterinary care is part of the definition of cruelty. So the animal control officers could be committing animal cruelty as part of their daily activities.
Well, animal cruelty is a felony in the state of Maryland, of course, but that would be up to a judge to decide should an animal control officer ever be charged with animal cruelty.
But many county residents have called us and said that they have been told that if they do not assume ownership of these wild animals, have them licensed and vaccinated, and keep them in their homes, the animals will be impounded.
Well, this is another thing that we need to look at, the impounding procedure. Let's look at the statute about and see what it says about impounding. And that's section 3-122. Impounding animals procedure. And it lists a dog found at large with a license, and it tells what to do. A dog found at large without a license, and it tells what the procedure is. C, in the event that an impounded animal shows signs of disease, and it tells what to do in that case. And then D, domesticated animals other than dogs may be impounded according to certain procedures.
So we're only talking about dogs and possibly other domestic animals. Again, I don't see anything about wild animals.
Well, since feral cats are wild and the statute only provides the procedure for impounding domestic animals, then it seems that the statute doesn't give Animal Management Division any authority to impound feral cats.
But many county residents have accepted the word of animal control officers who told them that they must assume ownership of the feral cats, that they need to take the animals into their house or the cats would be impounded. And of course, they know that means that the animals would be killed. And so they did take them into the house.
Yes, and then when more feral cats showed up in the neighborhood, the same animal control officer came back and told them that they had to take those animals into the house or those would be impounded.
I know of cases which this has resulted in people winding up with housefuls of cats that really don't belong there because they were feral. Of course, they were not owned by the person in the first place, and the whole situation was created by animal control policy.
Then what happens is it becomes apparent that you have a house full of cats and the person is accused of being a hoarder.
I've seen appeals go out over the internet that say something like, please help with the placement of a large number of feral cats. The cats have been kept indoors, they're healthy, and have been well cared for.
Well, you know, hoarding is a psychological disorder, but that's not the way that that disorder presents. The fact of the matter is that the person was simply compassionate and trying to save the lives of the animals and was forced into that situation by the animal control officers.
After reading it, though, it looks to me as though animal control is misinterpreting the statute, charging county residents with violations of laws that don't really exist, and possibly committing animal cruelty themselves.
Well, that's exactly what we told the Department of Environmental Resources that oversees Animal Management Division when we met with them back in June of 2008.
When they learned about this, what did they do?
Well, 8 months passed, and during that time, Animal Control continued to give citations for and fine people large amounts of money for feeding wild animals. One person contacted us who had been fined $1,500 by Animal Control for feeding feral cats. She appealed the fine, and in February 2009, 5 days before her hearing, we got a letter from the Office of Law.
I'm sure that the timing of the letter was coincidental. What did the letter say?
I'm sure it was. Well, it says first of all, there's some niceties at the beginning of the letter.